Did you know that a single river in France has shaped the genetic destiny of millions of people for over 1,000 years? Or that the DNA of people from Brittany is more closely linked to Ireland than to their own French neighbors? France's DNA is like an ancient puzzle, with each piece revealing a chapter in the story of Europe's migrations, wars, and cultural evolution. From the icy grip of the last ice age to the bustling streets of modern Paris, the genetic tapestry of the French people is one of the most fascinating and complex in the world. But why does French DNA intrigue historians, scientists, and even everyday people so much? The answer lies not just in the science of genetics, but in what it tells us about how humans have moved, mixed, and survived over millennia. French DNA isn't just a collection of molecules, it's a living map of history. It reflects ancient migrations from Anatolia, steppe warriors who carried their legacy across Europe, and even medieval plagues that left their mark on the genetic code of the population. And what's even more incredible is how regional identities, like the Basques, Bretons, and Gascons, have been preserved within this genetic mosaic despite centuries of invasions and cultural changes. In this video, we'll unravel the secrets hidden within French DNA. We'll explore how its geography has made it a genetic crossroads of Europe, how ancient migrations shaped its people, and why historians believe studying French genetics can unlock mysteries about the broader story of human history. So, stay with us as we dive into a journey through time, one that bridges the ancient world with our modern understanding of genetics. By the end of this video, you'll see why French DNA continues to fascinate, surprise, and connect us all in ways we never imagined. France's geography has been a silent architect in shaping its genetic story. Imagine a country cradled by natural boundaries. To the north, the English Channel. To the south, the Pyrenees, the Alps in the southeast, and rivers like the Loire and Garonne carving their way through the land. These features weren't just barriers or landmarks. They were pathways for human movement and the boundaries that shaped genetic flow. Let's start with the basics. France's central location in Europe positioned it as a natural bridge between north and south, east and west. During the Ice Age, when much of northern Europe was uninhabitable, the warmer Franco-Cantabrian refuge in the south became a sanctuary for early humans. As the glacier receded, these groups expanded northward, bringing their genetic legacy with them. This is why the DNA of modern Europeans, from Britain to Scandinavia, carries echoes of ancient populations that once called southern France home. But France wasn't just a refuge, it was a highway. The Neolithic farmers who brought agriculture from Anatolia passed through its southeastern corridors, leaving behind not just their farming techniques but also their genetic imprint. Later, the great migration of steppe pastoralists from Eurasia swept into northern France, introducing traits that are still detectable in the DNA of people in Normandy and Brittany. These were not just isolated events, they were part of a larger genetic dialogue that France facilitated between Europe's north and south. And then, there were the rivers. The Loire and Garonne, for example, acted as natural dividers but also connected people through trade and travel. However, these rivers weren't always easy to cross. In fact, historical records show that flooding often made the Loire impassable, effectively isolating communities on either side. This created subtle genetic differences that are still detectable today, with populations north of the Loire showing stronger ties to northern Europe, and those to the south sharing more with the Iberian Peninsula. France's geographic position didn't just shape its internal diversity, it connected it to neighboring regions in unique ways. In the south, the Gascons and Basques exhibit genetic traits that tie them closely to the Iberian Peninsula. In the north, populations like the Bretons share remarkable genetic similarities with the Irish and Welsh, a legacy of ancient Celtic migrations across the English Channel. This constant interplay between isolation and connection, driven by geography, has given France a genetic legacy unlike any other. It's a place where history, culture, and biology meet, creating a living mosaic that scientists and historians are still unraveling today. Among the rich tapestry of French genetics, two regions stand out for their fascinating uniqueness: the Basque Country in the southwest and Brittany in the northwest. These areas aren't just culturally distinct, they are genetically extraordinary, offering historians and geneticists clues to Europe's distant past. Let's begin with the Basques. Often referred to as a genetic outlier in Europe, the Basques have long intrigued scientists. Why? Because their DNA reveals minimal influence from the major migrations that shaped much of the continent. While most European populations carry a mix of steppe pastoralist, Neolithic farmer, and hunter-gatherer ancestry, the Basques have retained a remarkably high proportion of early European hunter-gatherer DNA. But it's not just their genetic makeup, it's their language, Euskara, a linguistic enigma that predates the Indo-European languages spoken across most of Europe. This combination of linguistic and genetic isolation points to the Basques being a relic of Europe's ancient past, possibly descendants of populations that took refuge in the Franco-Cantabrian region during the Ice Age. Even within France, Basques stand apart. Genetic studies show that the Basques of France share stronger ties with their Spanish counterparts than with other French populations. This isn't surprising when you consider that the Pyrenees, while a natural border, served more as a bridge for cultural and genetic exchange between Basque communities on either side. Now, let's travel to the northwest, to Brittany. Here, another fascinating genetic story unfolds. The Bretons share a striking connection with populations across the English Channel, particularly the Welsh, Cornish, and Irish. How did this happen? The story dates back to the post-Roman era, when waves of Britons fled the Anglo-Saxon invasions of Britain and settled in Armorica, which later became Brittany. Genetically, Bretons carry higher levels of steppe ancestry compared to southern French populations. This links them to the ancient Belgica culture, which brought steppe ancestry to Western Europe during the Bronze Age. But what's truly remarkable is the genetic continuity in Brittany. Despite centuries of migration and cultural change, studies show that Bretons today still carry genetic signatures closely resembling those of Iron Age Celtic populations. Both the Basques and Bretons challenge the idea of a homogeneous French genetic identity. Instead, they highlight the layers of history embedded in the DNA of regional populations. The Basques remind us of Europe's deep past, a time before farming transformed the continent. The Bretons connect us to the cultural and genetic ties that once spanned the Celtic world. Together, these two groups demonstrate how France's regions hold pieces of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that helps us understand not just France, but Europe's ancient history. And perhaps most intriguing of all, they remind us that even in a world of increasing globalization, local genetic legacies can endure. When we think of borders, we often imagine lines drawn on a map, political divisions made by humans. But in France, nature itself has played an extraordinary role in shaping genetic distinctions. Rivers and mountains, two of the country's most prominent geographic features, have left a profound imprint on the genetic makeup of its people. Let's start with the rivers, particularly the Loire. Known as the longest river in France, the Loire isn't just a physical barrier, it's also a genetic one. Studies reveal a distinct difference in the DNA of populations north and south of the Loire. To the north, steppe ancestry, a genetic signature of migrations from the Eurasian steppes during the Bronze Age, is more prominent. Meanwhile, populations south of the river show higher proportions of Neolithic farmer ancestry, connecting them to the Mediterranean migration route. But why would a river influence genetic variation? The answer lies in history and geography. The Loire has long been a formidable natural obstacle. During floods, its vast width and fast flow made it nearly impossible to cross, limiting contact between communities on either side. This natural division preserved genetic distinctions that might have otherwise blended over time. Another river that played a role is the Garonne in southwestern France. This river historically separated the Celtic Gauls from the Aquitanians, an ancient population linked to modern Basques. Even today, genetic studies find noticeable distinctions in the DNA of populations living on either side of the Garonne, underscoring its enduring impact as a boundary. Now, let's turn to the mountains. France is surrounded by some of Europe's most iconic ranges, the Pyrenees, the Alps, and the Jura. The Pyrenees, which form the border between France and Spain, are particularly noteworthy. These towering peaks acted as a barrier, isolating the Basques and preserving their unique genetic and linguistic identity. While other parts of France saw waves of migration and genetic mixing, the Pyrenees sheltered the Basque population, allowing them to retain genetic markers that linked them to Europe's ancient hunter-gatherers. In the southeast, the Alps and the Jura Mountains also played a role in shaping genetic diversity. Historically, these rugged terrains were difficult to traverse, limiting movement and trade. As a result, populations on either side developed distinct genetic profiles. For example, French communities near the Alps often show genetic ties to northern Italy, reflecting limited but localized gene flow across these natural barriers. Even within France, the Massif Central, a highland region in the middle of the country, helped maintain genetic isolation for centuries. Its steep slopes and sparse population made it challenging for large-scale migrations to occur. This isolation allowed for the development of unique genetic clusters in the surrounding areas, such as in Oven. What makes this interplay between geography and genetics so fascinating is how enduring it has been. Despite modern transportation and globalization, these ancient genetic divides persist, offering a glimpse into how humans and nature have shaped one another over thousands of years. France's rivers and mountains aren't just scenic backdrops, they are silent witnesses to millennia of human history. They've influenced where people settled, who they interacted with, and even how their DNA evolved. The Loire, the Pyrenees, the Alps, they remind us that nature doesn't just shape landscapes, it shapes the very fabric of our identities. When we think of the Celts, our minds often wander to Ireland or Scotland, lands steeped in Celtic tradition. But there's another region just across the English Channel that shares deep roots with this ancient culture: Brittany, the rugged, windswept peninsula in northwestern France. What makes Brittany's Celtic connection so fascinating is how it's reflected not just in its culture and language but also in its DNA. To understand Brittany's genetic mystery, we have to travel back thousands of years to the Bronze Age. During this time, the Belbeaker culture, known for its distinctive pottery and advanced metalworking, spread across Europe. These people carried with them steppe ancestry, a genetic signature linked to migrations from the Eurasian steppes. While the Belbeaker culture had a significant impact across France, its genetic footprint is strongest in Brittany. Studies show that modern Bretons have some of the highest levels of steppe ancestry in all of France, comparable to populations in Ireland and Wales. But the story doesn't end there. Fast forward to the late Roman period, around the 4th and 5th centuries CE, when the collapse of the empire created a wave of migration. Britons fleeing Anglo-Saxon invasions crossed the Channel to settle in what we now call Brittany. This migration reinforced the region's genetic ties to the British Isles. Genetic studies reveal that the DNA of modern Bretons is closer to that of the Welsh, Cornish, and Irish than to other French populations. This connection isn't just genetic, it's linguistic and cultural too. The Breton language, a Celtic tongue closely related to Welsh and Cornish, has survived centuries of pressure from the dominant French language. Place names, traditional music, and festivals in Brittany all bear the hallmarks of a shared Celtic heritage. So, what kept Brittany so distinct from the rest of France? Geography played a crucial role. The region's rugged coastline and isolation from the French interior helped preserve its genetic and cultural identity. Historically, the dense forests and marshes of the Armorican Massif further limited movement into and out of Brittany, making it a sort of genetic time capsule. But it wasn't just isolation that shaped Brittany's genetic profile. Connections across the Atlantic played an equally important role. Archaeological evidence points to extensive trade networks between Brittany, Ireland, and Western Britain as early as the Neolithic period. Megalithic monuments, like the famous standing stones at Carnac in Brittany, bear striking similarities to those in Ireland, hinting at shared traditions and exchanges. Even today, the people of Brittany carry the legacy of these ancient connections. Genetic studies show a higher frequency of certain traits in the Breton population that are also common in the British Isles. For example, mutations associated with hemochromatosis, a condition linked to iron metabolism, are found at elevated rates in both Bretons and Irish populations. These shared genetic traits highlight a deep and enduring bond that spans millennia. Brittany's genetic uniqueness isn't just a relic of the past, it has implications for the future. Understanding the region's distinct genetic makeup can provide valuable insights into disease research and help us uncover the ways migration and isolation have shaped human history. As we unravel the Celtic connection, Brittany reminds us that history is written not only in books and artifacts but also in the strands of DNA we carry. This small corner of France, with its windswept cliffs and ancient traditions, offers a glimpse into the intricate tapestry of European heritage, one that links the past, present, and future in ways that continue to fascinate. France is often called the crossroads of Europe, a country where the continent's geography and history intersect. But what if we told you that its rivers, those meandering waterways we associate with culture and trade, have also played a silent, yet pivotal role in shaping the genetic identity of its people? Let's dive into how France's natural barriers like rivers and mountains didn't just define its borders, they sculpted its DNA. When we think about migration and settlement in history, we often focus on large-scale events like wars or conquests. But geography often worked in subtler ways, acting as both a guide and a gatekeeper for human movement. In France, rivers like the Loire, Garonne, and Adour didn't just flow, they divided. These rivers formed natural barriers that influenced where people could settle, how communities interacted, and ultimately, how genes flowed across the landscape. Take the Loire River, for example, which runs through the heart of France. For centuries, this river served as a boundary, culturally, politically, and genetically. Historical records reveal that the Loire separated the Celtic-speaking Gauls of the north from the more Romanized populations in the south. But genetics takes this story further. Modern DNA studies show a clear divide in ancestry between the northern and southern populations of France, with people north of the Loire carrying higher proportions of steppe ancestry, linked to Bronze Age migrations, while southern populations bear more Neolithic farmer ancestry, originating from the Mediterranean. But why would a river have such a profound impact on genetics? The answer lies in geography and history. In the past, rivers like the Loire were not just picturesque landmarks, they were formidable obstacles. The Loire was known for its fierce floods, making it nearly impossible to cross without modern infrastructure. These natural challenges discouraged large-scale interaction between communities on either side, allowing genetic differences to persist over time. The Garonne River in southwestern France tells a similar story. Historically, it separated the Celtic Gauls from the Aquitani, an ancient people with closer ties to the Iberian Peninsula. Today, genetic studies reveal that southwestern populations still carry unique genetic markers that set them apart from other French regions. This includes higher levels of Iberian-related ancestry and even traces of Basque DNA, reflecting the area's deep connections with Spain and the Basque Country. And then there's the Adour River, another geographic boundary in southwestern France. In modern genetic studies, this river aligns closely with a division between clusters of populations, particularly those with higher levels of Basque ancestry. This genetic distinction suggests that even small rivers could create localized pockets of genetic isolation, shaping the DNA of the people who lived there. But rivers weren't the only barriers. France's mountainous regions, like the Pyrenees and the Alps, also acted as genetic bottlenecks, limiting movement and encouraging distinct regional identities. The Pyrenees, for example, played a key role in preserving the unique genetic makeup of the Basques, whose DNA remains one of the most distinct in Europe. While rivers and mountains often limited gene flow, they didn't completely isolate populations. Over time, trade routes, political changes, and advancing technology allowed communities to bridge these natural divides. However, the legacy of these barriers remains visible in the genetic map of France. Studies show that people living near rivers or mountains often share more genetic similarity with their neighbors than with populations just a few hundred kilometers away. What's truly fascinating is how these natural barriers not only shaped genetic diversity but also influenced culture. Many of France's regional languages and traditions align closely with these geographic divides. The langue d'oil of northern France and the langue d'oc of the south, for instance, roughly follow the genetic and cultural divisions created by the Loire. In southwestern France, Basque culture and language thrive in areas where genetic studies show minimal gene flow from surrounding populations, highlighting the connection between DNA and identity. So, why does any of this matter today? Understanding how geography shaped France's genetic structure isn't just about unraveling the past, it's about informing the future. By studying genetic diversity across regions, scientists can better understand how populations adapted to their environments, how diseases spread, and how certain genetic traits evolved. For example, regions like Brittany, where genetic distinctiveness is strong, provide clues about the historical movement of diseases and the persistence of rare genetic traits. Ultimately, France's rivers and mountains remind us that history isn't just about kings and battles, it's written in the land itself. Geography shaped where people lived, who they interacted with, and how their genes were passed down through the generations. And as we trace the flow of history through France's waterways, we see a story not just of division but of connection, of how a landscape united diverse peoples into the rich tapestry of modern France. Brittany, France's rugged northwestern peninsula, has long stood apart, with its own language, culture, and history. But what if we told you that Brittany's uniqueness extends deep into its DNA? And even more fascinating, its genetic ties reach across the Celtic Sea to connect with the British Isles, particularly Wales, Cornwall, and Ireland. Let's uncover the genetic story of Brittany and its surprising connection to the Atlantic Celtic fringe. To understand Brittany's genetic roots, we need to look back thousands of years. The region, known in ancient times as Armorica, was sparsely populated during the Paleolithic and early Neolithic periods. But during the later Neolithic, Brittany became a hotspot for megalithic culture, with monuments like Carnac stone alignments standing as silent witnesses to its early inhabitants. Genetic evidence suggests that Brittany's Neolithic population shared ancestry with other Atlantic-facing regions, like northern Iberia and the British Isles, reflecting early maritime connections along the Atlantic facade. But the most striking genetic shift came during the Bronze Age, with the arrival of steppe ancestry. This new wave of migration, linked to the Belbeaker culture, swept across Europe, leaving a profound impact on Brittany. Today, modern Bretons carry one of the highest proportions of steppe-related ancestry in France, comparable to levels found in the British Isles. Archaeological evidence of copper and tin trade between Brittany, Ireland, and Cornwall further supports this deep connection, hinting at the shared economic and cultural exchanges that shaped the region during this time. Fast forward to the Iron Age, and Brittany was home to several Celtic tribes, including the Veneti and Osismii, who were closely connected to the broader Celtic world. Genetic studies reveal that Brittany's DNA aligns closely with Celtic-speaking regions of the British Isles, particularly Ireland, Wales, and Cornwall. This suggests a shared ancestry that predates the Roman conquest of Gaul, when Celtic culture flourished across Western Europe. But the story doesn't end there. The fall of the Roman Empire brought new waves of migration to Brittany, particularly from Britain. During the 4th and 5th centuries, Britons fleeing Anglo-Saxon invasions crossed the sea and settled in what is now Brittany. These migrants brought their language, Breton, which remains closely related to Welsh and Cornish, and their genes. Modern genetic studies show that Bretons share significant allele similarities with Welsh and Cornish populations, supporting historical accounts of this migration. What's fascinating is how these migrations preserved Brittany's unique genetic makeup. While the rest of France saw waves of Roman and later Germanic influence, Brittany remained relatively isolated, shielded by its geography and its ties to the Atlantic world. This isolation allowed its genetic profile to remain distinct, with strong links to the British Isles and only minimal mixing with the surrounding French populations. Today, genetic studies reveal a clear separation between Brittany and the rest of France. In fact, Bretons are genetically closer to populations from Wales and Ireland than they are to their nearest French neighbors. Principal component analysis of DNA samples shows Breton clusters overlapping with Irish and Welsh groups, while other French populations align more closely with Central and Southern Europeans. This genetic connection isn't just a quirk of history, it has real-world implications. For example, certain genetic mutations, like those linked to hemochromatosis and cystic fibrosis, are found at higher frequencies in Brittany, Ireland, and Wales. This shared genetic legacy is a reminder of the deep historical ties between these regions. But what makes Brittany's connection to the British Isles so enduring? Part of the answer lies in its geography. As a peninsula jutting into the Atlantic, Brittany has always been oriented toward the sea, fostering connections with other coastal regions. Its rugged landscape and relative isolation from the rest of France also played a role, allowing its unique genetic and cultural identity to flourish. Yet Brittany is not just a relic of the past, it's a living testament to the resilience of its people and their traditions. The Breton language, though endangered, is still spoken today, and festivals celebrating Celtic music and dance draw crowds from across the world. This cultural vitality reflects the deep-rooted sense of identity that has been shaped, in part, by Brittany's genetic heritage. In the end, Brittany's story reminds us that DNA is more than a record of ancestry. It's a bridge to understanding how history, culture, and geography intertwine. Its genetic connection to the British Isles isn't just about shared bloodlines. It's a testament to the enduring ties that have shaped the Atlantic world for millennia. France's genetic landscape is not just a reflection of migration and history. It's profoundly shaped by geography. Rivers, mountains, and seas have acted as both bridges and barriers, influencing how populations mixed, settled, and evolved over thousands of years. Today, the French genetic map reveals subtle yet striking patterns, with some divisions that can be traced directly to the country's natural features. Let's dive into how geography has woven itself into the DNA of France. To understand the connection between geography and genetics, let's first look at one of France's most iconic natural features, the Loire River. Spanning over 1,000 kilometers, the Loire is more than just a picturesque landmark, it's a historical divide. For centuries, this river has served as a natural boundary between northern and southern France, shaping cultural, political, and genetic identities. Recent genetic studies show a clear division in DNA profiles on either side of the Loire. Populations north of the river carry higher levels of steppe ancestry, linked to migrations during the Bronze Age. This genetic signature aligns them more closely with northern and central European populations, such as those in Germany and the British Isles. Meanwhile, populations south of the Loire have greater Neolithic farmer ancestry, reflecting the Mediterranean wave of migration that spread through southern Europe thousands of years ago. But why does the Loire create such a sharp genetic divide? The answer lies in its geography. Historically, the Loire was a wide, fierce river, prone to flooding and creating natural barriers that were difficult to cross. Before modern infrastructure, its fast flow and lack of fords meant that populations on either side had limited interaction. This isolation by resistance allowed distinct genetic patterns to develop over time, making the Loire a key player in France's genetic puzzle. Rivers aren't the only features shaping the genetic map of France. The Pyrenees, a rugged mountain range on the border with Spain, have had a similar effect. The Basque people, living on both sides of the Pyrenees, are genetically distinct from their French and Spanish neighbors. Studies reveal that Basque DNA has remained remarkably unchanged for millennia, showing a unique mix of hunter-gatherer and Neolithic farmer ancestry with minimal influence from later migrations. This genetic distinctiveness is due in large part to the Pyrenees, which acted as a protective barrier, preserving the Basque population's unique heritage. Similarly, the Alps have influenced genetic patterns in eastern France. These towering peaks historically limited migration, creating pockets of genetic distinctiveness in regions like Savoy and Provence. However, unlike the Pyrenees, the Alps also served as corridors for trade and cultural exchange with neighboring Italy. This dual role, both isolating and connecting, has left a subtle but fascinating genetic imprint on the populations of southeastern France. Then there's Brittany, France's northwestern peninsula. Surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean, Brittany's geography fostered maritime connections with the British Isles while limiting interaction with the French mainland. As a result, modern Bretons are genetically closer to populations in Wales, Cornwall, and Ireland than to their neighbors in Normandy or the Loire Valley. This genetic legacy is a direct reflection of Brittany's orientation toward the sea and its historic role as a hub for Atlantic trade and migration. Even France's plains and plateaus tell a story. The fertile northern plains, including regions like Île-de-France, have long been a crossroads for migration. Over centuries, waves of people from northern and central Europe passed through, leaving a blended genetic signature. In contrast, the more rugged terrain of the Massif Central in central France created pockets of relative isolation. Here, local populations maintained distinct genetic profiles, influenced less by external migrations and more by local adaptation. It's not just large-scale geography that matters. Smaller features, like river valleys and coastal inlets, have also played a role in shaping genetic patterns. For instance, studies of southwestern France reveal how rivers like the Garonne and Adour create subtle genetic distinctions even within regions. These waterways, while facilitating some movement, also created natural boundaries that limited gene flow between nearby populations. Interestingly, genetic patterns in France also align with linguistic and cultural boundaries. For example, the historical division between Langue d'Oil in the north and Langue d'Oc in the south broadly matches genetic differences, with the Loire acting as a dividing line. This suggests that geography, language, and genetics are deeply intertwined, each influencing the other over time. But what about modern times? Have technological advances erased these geographical divides? To some extent, yes. Improved transportation and urbanization have increased genetic mixing in cities and along major transportation routes. Yet, despite these changes, traces of ancient geographical influences remain in the DNA of rural populations, offering a glimpse into France's long and complex history. France's genetic puzzle is a reminder of how intertwined human history is with the land we inhabit. Geography doesn't just shape landscapes. It shapes lives, identities, and even the DNA we carry. From the towering Alps to the flowing Loire, France's natural features have left a lasting legacy, written in the genetic code of its people. Brittany, a region in the far northwest of France, feels like a world apart. Its rugged coastline, ancient standing stones, and distinct cultural identity make it unique among French regions. But Brittany's distinctiveness isn't just cultural. It's written in its DNA. Studies reveal that the people of Brittany share a closer genetic connection with the Celtic populations of Ireland, Wales, and Cornwall than with many other regions of France. Let's explore how Brittany became a genetic and cultural outlier in the French mosaic. Brittany's story begins with its geography. Jutting into the Atlantic Ocean, Brittany is a peninsula that has historically been both connected to and isolated from the rest of France. Surrounded by water on three sides, its natural borders have limited overland migrations while fostering maritime connections with the British Isles. This unique position set the stage for Brittany's Celtic connection, which continues to resonate in the DNA of its people. The roots of Brittany's Celtic identity lie in the Iron Age, when the region was part of Armorica, a land inhabited by Celtic tribes like the Veneti and Osismii. These tribes shared cultural and linguistic ties with other Celtic peoples across Europe, including those in Ireland, Wales, and Cornwall. But Brittany's genetic connection to the Celtic world was solidified later, during the 4th to 6th centuries AD. As the Roman Empire declined, waves of migrants crossed the Celtic Sea from what is now Wales, Cornwall, and Devon, fleeing Anglo-Saxon invasions. These Britons brought their language, culture, and genes, reshaping Brittany's identity. The region even took its name from these newcomers, becoming Brittany or Bretagne, a reflection of its ties to Britain. Today, genetic studies confirm this historic connection. DNA analysis shows that modern Bretons are more closely related to populations in Wales, Cornwall, and Ireland than to their neighbors in Normandy or the Loire Valley. One striking example is the prevalence of specific genetic markers associated with Celtic ancestry. These markers are found at high frequencies in Brittany and are also common in the British Isles, pointing to a shared genetic legacy that dates back centuries. But what makes this connection even more fascinating is how it has endured. While most regions in France experienced significant genetic mixing due to invasions, migrations, and trade, Brittany's geographic isolation helped preserve its Celtic heritage. The region's rugged terrain and lack of major riverways made it less accessible, limiting the influx of new populations. This isolation is reflected not only in Brittany's genetic makeup but also in its cultural traditions. Breton, a Celtic language closely related to Welsh and Cornish, is still spoken in parts of the region today, despite centuries of pressure from the French state to assimilate. The language, like the DNA, is a living reminder of Brittany's deep ties to the Celtic world. Interestingly, Brittany's genetic distinctiveness isn't limited to its Celtic connection. Studies show that the region also retains traces of even older ancestry. For example, Breton DNA reveals higher levels of hunter-gatherer ancestry compared to other parts of France, a legacy of the region's early inhabitants. This suggests that Brittany's isolation not only preserved its Celtic heritage but also protected genetic traces from earlier chapters of human history. Brittany's connection to the Celtic world also explains some of its unique health traits. The region has higher frequencies of certain genetic variants linked to conditions like hemochromatosis and cystic fibrosis, which are also common in Ireland and Wales. Researchers believe these shared genetic traits are a result of the same migrations that shaped Brittany's Celtic identity. But while Brittany's DNA sets it apart, it's important to remember that genetics is only part of the story. The region's identity is a blend of history, culture, and geography, each layer adding depth to the picture. The same seas that brought Celtic migrants to Brittany also connected it to a wider Atlantic world, influencing its traditions and trade networks. In many ways, Brittany's story is a reminder of the power of connection and isolation. It's a region that has embraced its ties to the Celtic world while remaining uniquely Breton. Its DNA, like its culture, tells a story of resilience and continuity, a bridge between the past and the present. As genetic research continues to uncover more about Brittany's unique place in the French and Celtic landscapes, one thing is clear. This small peninsula holds a wealth of stories waiting to be told. And whether you're tracing its ancient migrations or walking among its windswept shores, Brittany will always stand out as a place where history and identity are deeply intertwined. As genetic research continues to evolve, the role of natural barriers in shaping human populations is becoming increasingly clear. In France, these features have not only preserved ancient histories but also contributed to the fascinating diversity of its modern DNA. Each river, mountain, and coastline tells a story of migrations delayed, cultures preserved, and identities shaped. Ultimately, France's genetic mosaic is a testament to the profound interplay between nature and human history. It reminds us that even in a world increasingly connected, the marks left by natural barriers can endure for millennia, leaving a legacy that continues to captivate historians, geneticists, and all those curious about our shared past.